if you want one. We're going to wrap up number 9. That's what's on the screen. It's the tail end of number 9. So we'll get 9 wrapped up, and then we're going to jump into 10 and get plowing into 10 and see how far we get there. And we're getting close to the end. 10 is it. That's the last one. And you'll notice 10 also has the date as 2022. It's because I thought we might get into it sooner when I printed it, but we are now on January 1. So the date's wrong, but that's all right. You'll be able to figure it out, I think. All right, so any questions about anything before we get rolling with our stuff today? Yes? In Genesis.
Yes. I think the first chapter, God says, let us make man.
Yep.
Who's he talking to?
Yeah, so in Genesis chapter 1, at about verse 23, God says, let us make man in our image. In the image of God, we will make him. And so the question is, who's the us? That's a good question. Scholars have all kinds of debates about this. If you're Jewish, you would say this is nothing more than a kind of a regal plural. And so it's, in other words, God puts himself in the plural, we shall do this. It's a little bit like when the queen says, or the king, we will do this. Well, who's the we? It's really just you. And it just gives it that kind of a regal thing. Now, it could be that. Christians, of course, read it and say, oh, no, duh. That's clearly a reference to the Trinity. And this is the Father having conversation with the Son and with the Holy Spirit. Let us make man in our image. There you go. It's a Trinitarian reference. And for Christians, yeah, that works great. Can you prove that? No. And is it like there's definitive? No. But it's kind of compelling and kind of nice. And so we'll say clearly the plural is an indication of the Trinity. It's a triune conversation. And just about every Christian assumes that and treats it that way. But can't prove it. Is that enough of an answer?
Well, I've read recently where some writers have said that he's talking to the heavenly host.
He's talking to the heavenly host. That would be another possibility. The problem with that is let us make, that would imply that they're involved in the creation itself. And so who's doing the making? So I would take issue with that interpretation by saying heavenly hosts weren't doing any of the making. They were made themselves. And so the heavenly host can't be part of that plural. The only possibility is God is in that plural. So who do we mean by God? That would be how I would look at that one. That's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah, but the heavenly hosts were made before the earth was created.
Somewhere in there. And so somewhere in the days of creation, the heavenly hosts were created, yes. So the angels and the angels that fell, all that happened, and we know that Satan had to have fallen before the temptation, whenever that is. Luther puts that on day 7, so who knows? And so it all happened in those days of creation.
There's also a plural in the creation itself where they say it's in the plural. I've forgotten what it is, but when he's creating the waters and the earth and everything, there's a plural in there as well.
Yeah, there are plenty of plurals. In fact, the Hebrew word for God, Elohim, is plural. And so in other words, it's kind of built in this pluralness to it. That's why the idea of the regal we or the regal plural is not so far-fetched, because even the name that Hebrew uses for God, Elohim, is a plural noun. It's just the way it works, even though it's a plural noun, but it takes singular verbs and that kind of stuff. So yes, there's a lot of that going on. Yep.
So in today's Old Testament reading, was it safe to read that as you're looking at the attributes of God's long-suffering, his wrath, and his forgiveness?
Mm-hmm. So are the attributes of God, his long-suffering, his wrath, his forgiveness, are all these attributes of God? Yeah, they're all characteristics of how God operates, the way that God is. Attributes is a strong word. We have a long tradition in the Western Church of talking about God's attributes and kind of listing them out. I'm not alone in this, but a lot of scholars would say, it's unhelpful, because we start dividing God too much out. God just is God. He just does his God thing. And to even talk about attributes of God can become misleading, because when we start thinking about all the stuff that God has to be God, well, no, there's no list. God's God in his godness. And the God who is the God who's made himself known, and that God does some things that surprise us sometimes, things we don't think he should do. And see, that's why the attributes things becomes an issue, because some people say, well, God has to be list. And then when the Bible, God doesn't seem to do those things, they get all concerned. Whoa, wait a minute, he's not doing what he's supposed to do. Whoa, that's the issue. What do you mean, supposed to do? And so God does what God does. And so the better thing is let God just be who he is, and the God we learn about is the God who has revealed himself in the story of his creation and salvation and redemption of the world as told in the Bible. That's the God we know.
So that's why we get in trouble when we talk about God's wrath and people start, wait a minute, God is not like that.
That's right. And to talk about God's wrath as an attribute, so, well, no, it's not really an attribute. That's his alien work, and we use that kind of language. You know, God, it's not what he does. He has to do it, but it's not who he is. These are all parsing things out, which doesn't become that helpful. You know, and the motivation there is, no. We want to have a God who's just all loving. That's the God I want to worship. Well, the God you need to worship is the God who has shown himself. And that God has wrath against sin. He does. And that God does things that we don't always understand. He does that kind of stuff. And if you start saying things like, well, my God wouldn't, that's huge warning to anybody. Because if your God wouldn't, probably you've got the wrong God. And you're the one who's got the problem, not God. And that's how we need to deal with this stuff. So yes, well said. All right, good. Anything else? All right, good. So let's wrap up study 9. I did not run new copies because we're doing like this much in the bottom of the page. And I felt like I would have been destroying paper and trees and all that stuff unnecessarily. So you don't get any, if you don't have a 9, sorry, deal with it. You can write it on the top of your 10 if you want to, if you want to write answers down. So we're at the very tail end of worksheet number 9, which is the very middle part of chapter 4 of Philippians, the last chapter in Philippians, and we're getting near the end. And we covered this a couple weeks ago when we had class together, where Paul is wrapping things up with a finally. And finally, brothers, then he gives this exhortation. Whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there's any excellence, if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. And this word dwell, it's got a footnote here. Ponder these things. Yeah, that's not bad. The Greek word, get it over here so you can take a quick look at that. The Greek word is logizesthe, and we get the word logic from that. So it looks like this in English, logizesthe. And so logizesthe, we get logic from that, and we get logical. And so head stuff, think about, occupy your mind with. And it's an imperative. Paul says, do this. It's not a little word of advice. It's not a little encouragement. He wants them to do this. Dwell on these things. Think about these things. And so we have this list of, we covered this a couple weeks ago, 6 things, whatever's true, noble, right, pure, pleasing, of good repute. And then we have the last 2, this pleasing and good repute, which really aim at aesthetics. And then all of these are in the context of whatever he says is, he gives 2 more, anything that is excellence, anything worthy of praise. And so these 2 things kind of capture everything. So the 2 that overwhelm everything, excellence needs to be there, and worthy of praise. So in other words, this is a list of good stuff, noble stuff, upright stuff, true things. And what Paul's getting at here is, I think, a very basic kind of fundamental attitude of the Christian. What kind of stuff do you think about? And you should be thinking about true things, and noble things, and encouraging things, and upright things, and pure things, things that have excellence, things that have good repute. In other words, things that build up and aim you towards God. And this takes work. It's not something that just happens automatically. That's why Paul makes it an imperative verb. Do it, he says. You've got to choose it. You've got to make the choice. And you know this is true. Living in the world, there is plenty of stuff you encounter that makes you think about not good stuff. And so you can be as innocent as just reading the news. And then you start worrying about, oh, what's going to happen in Ukraine? Oh, what's going on in the decadence of our culture? And oh, they just passed this new law. I can't believe it. And what are you dwelling on? Yeah. Are you thinking about what is true, what is noble, what is of good repute? No, you're getting all occupied with garbage. And you're getting really concerned about the junk. And that's what Paul says, don't do that. Don't do that. Now, does this mean that you need to be ignorant of stuff going on in the world? No. And this means, oh, I probably should quit reading the news. No, it doesn't mean that. You need to be aware of what's happening. You need to be tuned into the world. But then you think about those things God's way, which means, first of all, you don't worry about them. There's never, ever any reason for any Christian to say, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? That's just stupid. Because you know what's going to happen. Christ is going to return. He's going to make all things new, right? So what are we worried about? Is the world going to get worse and worse and worse? We have been told it will. Big surprise. Newsflash. Guess what? Are things going to go to hell in a handbasket out there in the world? Yes. Yes. What can we do to stop it? Nothing. Yeah, that's the reality. That's the reality. So quit wringing your hands. Quit being shocked about the latest horrible thing. What's new? It's been this way since the fall, people, and it will be this way until Christ comes again. It's fine. That's why when you deal with the junk in the world, you don't let that overwhelm you. Instead, you think about what is true and noble and right and praiseworthy. What's that stuff? That's the Christ stuff. That's the God who creates. That's the God who's still at work, even in a broken world, bringing joy and even bringing beauty, and it happens, and it's there. Well, look for it. So Christians have this weird way of operating. We're utterly realistic. We're not weird, optimistic pie in the sky. Oh, it's all great. No, it's not. It's junk. But at the same time, are we worried about that? No. Are we dragged down by that? No, no, no. We see the beauty in the midst of the junk all the time because we work at it. We choose it. That's how we operate. So we don't go through with a pessimistic, sad sack, oh, remorseful, oh, it's all bad. No, we have joy in the midst of the badness. And that's the kind of reality that should norm Christians, and that's what Paul's getting at. He wants the Philippians to live this way, to function this way, to operate this way, and it's a choice they need to make. It's a choice you make in how you operate and how you deal with life. That's what Paul's getting at. So never get caught flat-footed like, I can't believe that happened. You should never say that. Christians should say, I'm surprised it didn't happen sooner. That's all. You know, because it's a broken world. What else is new? And yet, is God still at work? Yeah. And is there beauty? And is there hope? And is there comfort? Absolutely. Always there.
So is it safe to say Paul is also implying that we're going to run into conflict because we're not thinking like the world, and the world wants us to
Absolutely.
how the world wants us to react, how they react.
Of course. When people react in ways that act like things are fine, they don't get flustered, that's annoying to other people. You know, why aren't you being like me? You should be worried. How come you're not worried? And yeah, the world doesn't want us to be different. We like sameness. So you bet. That's part of the issue. And that gets to the witness that the church brings. We don't do it the way the world does it. That's the point. Yep.
However, being different in that way just might correct some of the problems.
Well, indeed. Are Christians meant to be salt and light in the world? Right. So we bring God's truth and we try to preserve. And when we're doing things, can we actually stem the evil a little bit? Sometimes. And can we bring some healing certain places? Yes. You think about Jesus' ministry as a parallel, I think there's a nice connection here. Did Jesus heal everybody in Palestine? No. He didn't. And did he reverse all suffering forever? Not yet. And so the church is the same way. We do what we can where we can. We make a difference, but we're not naive about that either. We're not going to make utopia on earth. We're not going to bring about a Christian nation. It ain't going to happen. Never will. But we keep working anyway. And we keep doing the right thing anyway. And we keep caring anyway in spite of what we know is going to happen. That's exactly what happened, how we operate. Yep.
If you think it is gathering, finding that sheep that's lost, if we can convert some, I think of the inner city churches. If they can have one or two
If we can, Paul says, by all means I become all things to all men, but that I might save some. So right, we're realistic. We do what we can, and we bring the truth, and we try to save one person at a time. And we start in our families, in our congregations, in our neighborhoods, and we do what we can. That's right. That's exactly right. All right, good. So, where do Christians get the necessary discernment to do this? Because how are we going to learn to see things? Where do we get this kind of new way of operating? Paul gives us that direction as well. Verse 9 is so cool. So he's wrapping things up. The things you have learned, mathetse, discipled is what you've been discipled into, would be even a better translation, because we get the word disciple from here, this as well. The things you have learned or been discipled and received. And what this is getting at, this idea of reception, really points to the idea of what we would call a rule of faith. The idea that there is this teaching that is part of the Christian faith. It's just there. We have a Latin phrase for this, the regula fide, the rule of faith, the analogy of faith, the received doctrine, that they have received this. So they have learned these things, they've received these things, they have heard them, literally because he was there with them, seen them, they've seen Paul live this way. The things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. So there's another imperative. Practice these things. Who is the example for the Philippians? It's Paul. It's Paul. Does Paul have any compunction about saying, follow my example? Not in the least. In fact, he's quite bold about this. He tells them in writing, do it like me. What you have seen in me, what you've heard in me, what you have learned, what you've received, do it. Practice it. And the word practice indicates you're working hard at it. It's not a one-time choice. My New Year's resolution, I'm going to be happy from now on. Yeah, right. Okay? Now, it's a practice. You work at it. You work at it. You work at it. You work at seeing the right things. You work at not letting anxiety overwhelm you. You work at not becoming despondent. You work at keeping the right attitude. These things take practice. And that's what Paul's getting at. And he gives a concrete example in himself. He is what it looks like. And so Paul is not afraid to say, do it like me. There's a serious challenge there for all parents and all leaders in the church, because you should be able to do the same thing. You should be able to stand up and look at a group and say, do it like me. And if you're not able to do that, get your act together. That's the challenge. It's not like, oh no, don't be like me. Well, then who are you supposed to be like? Where's the example for people? Where's the concrete instance of what this looks like? We need to set an example here. So that's what Paul's getting at, and he's not afraid to do it. Quite remarkable. Do these things, and what will happen when you practice these things? The God of peace, and there's the peace thing, will be with you. So God will be with you, and he brings his peace with you. So, what are the ways that we do this? Well, the other way comes way back up earlier in this section where Paul talks about be anxious about nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known to God. So there's your first part of the two-part thing. So what's the first way we learn to have this kind of way of operating? We pray. We pray a lot. And why does that matter? Because it puts God in the center. And then what's the second way we do this? We follow the example of saints. And we practice. So, 2 P's. Pray and practice. And what are you practicing? You're practicing a virtuous life. A life that focuses on doing things God's way. That's what we do. So we pray and we do what Paul did, and we practice it, we practice it, we practice it. Now, this is kind of cool because these two aspects capture the fullness of the Christian life. Because when we pray, what are we doing? We're putting all of our attention on God. And so if you think about you, the individual Christian living here, when you're praying, you're looking up towards God. And so you're all zeroing in on that relationship between you and God. You're saying, God, help me, and God says, I'll take care of it, and he does it. And then when you're learning to think about the true things and the virtuous things and the right things, what are you doing? You're thinking about how you operate in the world around you. And so now you're zeroing in on your relationship with the rest of the world around you, the horizontal kinds of things. And so it's kind of cool here that Paul covers the vertical aspect of our lives and the horizontal aspect of our lives. We are right in our God relationship. We're getting straightened out in our horizontal relationships. And then we live rightly related. And if you recognize, of course, this starts to look a lot like a cross. And so this is what I would say Paul shows us the cruciform life. And cruciform means cross-shaped. And that life ends in peace. Because when you live with Christ as the center, trusting God, and your prayers are square, you know what God's doing, and you're living rightly oriented to those around you, that's the cruciform life. And the cross reminds us also of suffering. And Paul has made it clear that when we are following Christ in our life, we can expect to suffer. It's part of how things work as well. It's part of this cruciform life. So there we have the tail end of section 9 or study 9. Any lingering questions about this part?
So it's interesting because when you look, we know that leaders in the church are not sinless.
They're not perfect,
Yet,
right?
they still have that example to follow, and they still have that ability to receive feedback when they do make a mistake,
Right.
and they can restore it back.
Right.
As
Yeah.
opposed to
Being able to hold yourself up as an example does not mean you're perfect or you have arrived. In fact, part of the example is showing people how you deal with the brokenness in your own life and the sin when it happens. And there's a way to deal with that too. It's called taking responsibility and repenting and receiving and giving forgiveness. And so that's part of what's going on as well. So if you're hesitant to think, well, I haven't arrived yet, well, nobody has. We're all in process. Paul's in process. He's not perfect. He knows that. And he makes that very clear in other parts of his epistles where he talks about the sin in his own life. It's still there. Read Romans 7. And so he's not arrived. And yet the very way he learns to deal with the sin in his life is exemplary. That's how it works. So yeah, it's all part of it. Good. All right. Any other questions? Yes.
Well, I know we talked before about this, but then right now we're dealing with a long list of people of death and sickness through this last month. And the idea is how do you reach out to people? And do you say, there's certain things I just don't know what I can say.
Yeah, so when you have people who are Christian people who are actually going through suffering, going through hard things, what do you say? How do you reach out? How do you bring them God's truth? And every situation will be different, and that's why you have experts who've been seminary trained who know what to say at any given moment. But now every situation is going to be different, and every circumstance is going to require different things to be said. The key is to be well grounded in that regular fide, that truth that's there, and you've got it. And so then when you have a situation and you have a person in front of you, you can say, this person's going through this situation, he needs to hear this part of the truth, and you bring it to bear. Now everybody needs to hear all the truth at some time or another. Sometimes things are better received at certain times than they are at other times, and that's part of the skill, the art that comes in of knowing what to say when to say it. But I would argue that faithful words are always going to be true. You're not going to say something just to kind of appease things. And so death is when these things really happen, or suffering, oh, God meant this for good. It's trite. What do you mean? Or God needed him more than you did. Well, that's a lie. You don't say dumb things like that. And so you have to be careful that you, in your attempt to comfort, you're not saying stupid, false things. So you say truth. But you don't have to maybe dump everything. You don't maybe say, God does whatever he wants. Sometimes he kills people. That's what happens. Okay, probably it's true, but probably not the best timing on that. And so that's where the sensitivity comes in. But the key is try to deliver as much of God's truth as they will be open to. And often when people are going through a crisis, they're ready to hear. They're more open. They're ready to get answers. And sometimes the answers we have to give aren't satisfying. Like, why did God do this? I don't know. What I do know is this. And then you start loading in what you do know. And that's the good care. But see, admitting what you don't know and being faithful to that regula fide helps a ton, which is one of the reasons why I insist all the time when I'm teaching, especially my students, doctrine matters. Doctrine matters. You've got to know your doctrine if you're going to be faithful in your ministry. And people who think, oh, I just need to know how to be nice. Well, based on what? Nice? No, it's got to have some kind of foundation underneath it, and that's why you've got to know your doctrine well so you know what to say and what not to say so you're not undercutting the reality of God's truth. Does that help? All right. Good. Anything else with 9? As you can tell, I'm ready to move on. All right. Let's go to 10, the very last one. We're there. Study 10, and we're in Philippians 4, starting at verse 10, getting ready to wrap up the tail end of this chapter. And now Paul is cruising quickly to the end. And Paul always has an idea where he's going, but sometimes his letters are fascinating because he gets these tendencies to kind of over here kind of a thing, and he gets sidetracked over here. Because remember, how did Paul write these letters? He was writing them, dictating them. And so in all reality, because he talks sometimes about the person who's writing the letter, and they even had a Greek word for this, amanuensis, literally his hand. And so Paul would have been dictating these letters. And so it's kind of cool to think about, and maybe there's a scribe there writing it down. Maybe it was Timothy or Luke. Maybe there was 2 or 3 guys writing it down because they knew they were going to copy it out anyway, because that's what they did. Paul would get done writing his letter, and then he would read it through. Yep, that's good. And then they would immediately start copying it. And they would copy it over maybe 12 or 24 times and send it all over the place. They were called encyclical letters, so out they went. And because they didn't have copy machines, and you didn't have electronic ways of disseminating information. And so they would make copies upon copies. So Paul is dictating this letter, which means that's why, and sometimes it comes across that way, where he will start, and this happens sometimes, he starts a thought and he gets going and he never quite wraps it up. And he moves on to something else. Well, that happens when you're just dictating and thinking. And you don't go back and, oh, wait a minute, I've got to clean that up. It's not like he was laboring, getting all worked out. You say, now, where's the Holy Spirit in all this? Well, he's in all of it, directing and guiding and working it all. That's what's kind of cool about this. So Paul, though, has a mind where he's going with his letter, obviously. And so everything has kind of been building to this point, and he's getting ready to deal with this one last thing he needs to cover. And this is one of the last kind of technical things we have to deal with in this letter, and that's back to this gift from the Philippians. So, that's the setup. Verse 10. But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at last you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned before, but you lacked an opportunity to act. Not that I speak from need, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with little. I also know how to live in prosperity. You see, that takes a little bit of practice, learning to live in prosperity. Americans need to learn that. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Nevertheless, you have done well to share with me in my difficulty. All right. Verse 13 is one of those cross-stitch verses. Everybody knows it. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Cross-stitch verse means you take it home, cross-stitch it, and put it on your wall because it's so cool. All right? So, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Everybody knows this verse, and they trot it out like, I can do everything through him who strengthens me. It's not what Paul's saying, obviously, in context. But we'll get there. Now, what's Paul talking about here? He's talking about reviving their concern for me and that they have shared with me in my difficulty. What's he talking about? He's talking about the gift the Philippians had sent him way back a long time ago. We covered this back in the fall somewhere, okay? So remember what started all this. That Paul is imprisoned in Rome. He's under house arrest, waiting trial before the emperor, Nero. And meanwhile, the Philippians are way back over there in Greece, and they have heard Paul's imprisoned in Rome. And so the Philippians are concerned for Paul. Why? He's their guy. He brought the faith to them. He started their church. They're Christians because of Paul. They love Paul. He's the one who brought them into the faith and shaped their church and taught them the truth. So they love Paul. He's in prison. So what do? They get some money together, they get a collection together, and they send a guy named Epaphroditus, probably a few others who went with them, and they head down to Rome with this big financial gift, and they deliver it to Paul. So again, you can't do a wire transfer, you can't send a certified check, you've got to actually haul the gold, and there you go, Paul, and they bring it to him. So that's what's going on here. They've brought this gift. That's what Paul has in mind. So he's finally getting around to dealing with this. In fact, this is so central to the letter that many people have said the letter to the Philippians is Paul's thank you letter to the Philippians. We're going to examine that here a little more closely in what we're dealing with, because that's exactly what he's getting at here. Has he said thank you here yet for anything? He has not. He's not said, thanks for the cash. He hasn't said that, okay? And if you're waiting for it, you're going to be waiting a while, okay? It's kind of interesting. So let's hear what he does do. So he starts off by saying, I rejoiced in the Lord. So it's past tense. In other words, when he got the gift, he rejoices in where? In the Lord. So in other words, he doesn't delight so much in the Philippians, he does, but this is God's work, and thank you, God. So in other words, you can imagine, Epaphroditus brings the gift, Paul's like, wow, perfect. Needed that to pay the rent, to pay for my food, to pay for the papyrus I need, to pay for my new parchments, whatever. He needs the cash, and it's helpful to him. And so when he gets the cash, what's he do? He thanks God. He rejoices in God because God, he knows, has supplied this through the Philippians' generosity. All right? So he rejoices that at last you have revived your concern for me, which is interesting. Because what's the implication that kind of comes through there? About time. Yeah, about time. You got around to it. Good. It's kind of interesting. All right, there's a little bit of a funny tone here. So if at last you've revived your concern for me, and it says, indeed, you were concerned before. So he knows they were concerned. But he says, but you lacked an opportunity to act. And this is vague, like crazy. What do you mean they lacked opportunity to act? And that's really the Greek word is kind of cool because it's the word for time, for season. It's like they didn't have the right season to act. And we can speculate whatever that might mean. Maybe it means that the weather was bad and they were all frozen in and they couldn't get out because there had been a blizzard and they lacked opportunity. That's unlikely, but I'm just giving you an example, okay? Another example might be maybe they said, wow, we should do something for Paul, so they checked out the congregational treasury and it was in a negative position. So what kind of gift can we send Paul? Well, nothing today. We don't have any cash reserves. So what do we need to do? Let's start saving up, and let's get a gift together, and we got to work at this. Because, see, these are not rich people, and we'll get a gift together, and then once we get enough, big enough, we'll send Epaphroditus. And that's most likely what's going on here. So they wanted to do something and literally weren't able. That's the implication Paul's getting at here. So I know you wanted to, but you weren't able to, but now you can, and that's great. So that's the setup. So let's get a few things filled in here to get started with this. So Paul turns now directly to the matter of the Philippians' gift. And this was, remember, a monetary gift that had been delivered by Epaphroditus, and Paul wants to deal with this. He's not going to ignore it. He's going to deal with this. Now, the big concern through this whole section, which is lost on us pretty largely, is overcoming normal social ideas that are at work. And these would be kind of social political ideas that are live in the culture at this time. Because in the Roman culture of the first century, there were certain rules and expectations about how gift giving went. And it was very elaborate. We know even living today in America, there are certain kinds of rules. If you get a Christmas card from someone, what do you need to do? Yeah, of course. You need to send them one. If you still send Christmas cards, they're starting to die. It's not a thing anymore, but it'll take a little while before the generation all dies off that thinks it matters. But I can remember it was a big deal. So, be getting Christmas cards when I was a kid, and we get a Christmas card from somebody, my mom would be like, oh, I didn't send them a card, quick. And she'd always have a half a dozen or more, laid aside, waiting, and she'd address it, boom, off it goes. Because there's a reciprocity expected, right? because it would be gauche and really crude not to respond and break some kind of social moray. So that's the idea here. Now, and the gift giving is the same kind of thing. So somebody gives you a gift, oh, I guess I need to give them a gift. And we have this kind of a reciprocity. Well, in the Roman society, it was even stronger and it was even more kind of laid out. And the way it worked in Roman society was that the gift giver was always in a position of authority. Because if I give a gift, that puts me kind of over the top of you. And now you are underneath my kind of authority. And this works the same way today. So a politician gets a big gift from a donor. What's that do? Does it create a power differential? Absolutely, which is why we have rules against it. You know, you can't take money because that's going to put you in their debt. And we all know how it works this way. In Roman society, it was even kind of just laid out. So if you give a big gift, it's not like it's an assumed thing. It's almost in writing. You need to do something. You're in the debt to the person who gave the gift. So what's going on here? The Philippians send a sizable gift to Paul. And in Roman society, what's the expectation immediately built in? Paul owes them. Paul owes them. They've done something for him. Paul owes them. But wait a minute. What's Paul's authority? He's an apostle. Does he owe something to anybody? See, this creates a very delicate thing. Paul doesn't want this to happen. Paul does not want the Philippians to feel like they've somehow got one over on Paul, or that Paul is in their debt, or that Paul owes them something. He doesn't want this to happen. In fact, he knows this can't happen because it upsets the whole differential of how things work in the kingdom of the church. You see, this is Paul's point. The church doesn't work the way the world does. The world works with all this kind of reciprocity and who owes who, and if somebody is rich and they give a big gift, then the person who is getting the gift is under their authority and in their debt. We all know it works that way. Paul's saying, no, 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 not in the church. And that's one of the reasons why Paul is going to be very careful here. He never says, thanks for the cash gift. Because if he did say that, then that would be like, yep, we gave the gift and you're the recipient. And we all know what that means. And Paul wants none of that. Okay? That's what's going on here. So the Greco-Roman conventions were all about status and all about power. And the gift giver had that. The gift giver had the status. The gift giver had the power. It's not so different today. It was even stronger in the Roman world, if you can believe that. Because we know how it kind of works in our world today. We just had 3 guys in St. Louis get convicted and sent to jail for taking bribes, right? Remember, that was a big deal because you see, you take money, that's not good, not cool. And so it's all about status, it's all about power, and Paul is trying to subvert this. So Paul subverts and reframes all of this way of thinking in very deliberate ways. And I'm going to kind of list out these ways for you, and then we're going to see through the rest of this chapter how he actually does these things. So what's the first thing he does? He gives no notion of debt owed to the giver. So the Philippians are not, he never gives any kind of indication that, yes, you Philippians gave this, and now I'm in your debt. How will I ever repay? You know, this kind of stuff we say to people. Somebody gives something really nice to you. You hear people say, oh, it's so generous of you. How can I ever repay you? And then you don't have to. But, yeah, we know, all right? And so it's the same kind of thing. But Paul never says this. Paul never says, how will I ever repay you? He doesn't say that. He never gives any indication that there's any debt. So there's no notion of debt owed at all. It's just not there. Okay? So that's the first thing that Paul does. Second thing that Paul does to subvert the usual ways of operating is he does not hint at repayment. No hint of repayment. So I'm not going to pay you back. I'm not going to do something. No repayment from Paul. He's not going to do something tit for tat. Or I'll write you an extra nice letter. Or I'll be praying extra hard for you. Or I'll put in a good word with you to God. You know, any of that kind of nonsense. You know, I don't have money, but I'll do what I can. None of that. None of that. There's nothing indicated here that Paul's going to do something special for the Philippians because of this gift. None of that. So there's no hint of repayment from Paul. Second thing he does. Third thing he does is he sees the gift as union with the Philippians. So with the Philippians and Paul. So in other words, what he sees going on here is that this gift actually unifies them. And see, this is what he says here at the very end of this verse. Oh, where is it? There we go. He says, you have done well to share with me in my difficulty. So in other words, by giving the gift, he says, you have aligned yourself with me. You've just joined me in my imprisonment. That's what your gift did. Your gift bound us together. And so instead of the gift creating a power differential, it brought a unity. It bound them together. So they are bound in the gift. And the gift is the symbol of that unity that is there. It's not a power status kind of thing being set up, but a unity that happens. Then the fourth thing he does, he recognizes that their gift is to God, not to him. And that's the biggest thing. And so he's recognizing that when they gave this gift to Paul, in fact, it's God who is the recipient. And so if the Philippians think that anybody owes them anything, it's going to be God who owes them. And so God will do the paying back. And we all know how God works. Okay? So it's not going to work that way. But the gift is to God, and so God will repay. And that Paul makes very clear. So what Paul is doing is he's taking this very nice gift from the Philippians, but he's resituating it and putting it in kind of a different way altogether. We saw this earlier back in chapter, I think it was 1 or 2, when Epaphroditus comes and Paul says, you did right to send him along. It's what you owed. See, it's almost the expectation that this is what they're supposed to do. Not like, oh, what a nice surprise, but no, it's what is expected. When you have something, you share it. That's what's going on here. So then there is a really strong point throughout this whole thing to undercut the way that things were operating in the Greek mind, in the Roman mind, and replace it with the Christian way of operating. Now, one last thing we need to recognize, which you can dig into this more if you want to, there's a real strong parallel with the beginning of the letter of Philippians. And some of the same vocab comes up here. One of the vocab words, when he says, you're concerned for me, I rejoice in the Lord greatly that at last you have revived your concern for me. You were concerned. But in verse 10, guess what the Greek word for concern is? It's phronein and phronete. Remember, we've heard this word countless times. And what does this mean? It's a way of thinking. And this has been a theme all through the letter. Paul uses the same verb one more time here. You were thinking about me. You wanted to think about me. This is great. And so when he does this, it recalls to mind the beginning of the letter, when he talks about, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always offering prayer with joy in my every prayer for all of you, in view of your participation in the gospel from now to now, confident he who began a work will complete it. And so what's Paul doing here? He's talking about what he had given them. And so what Paul is doing here is by using this same kind of vocabulary and bringing out these parallels, he's reminding them of the beginning of the letter when he was the giver. When he was the giver. And so that's kind of the point. So we have this contrast. Instead of the Philippians seeing themselves as, we're the ones giving to Paul, Paul's reminding them, I'm the one who's been giving to you, and now you're giving to me, and that's how it works in the church. So the word concern for me is actually phronein. That's that loaded word, the way of thinking. So a way of thinking. And what this does is it ties the sections together. So it ties this part to the rest, ties it all together. All right, so what might have hindered their previous giving? Perhaps it was a lack of funds. That's a very good guess. Or maybe it was, maybe they're waiting for the tax returns to come in. Who knows? You know, my tax refund will come and then we can give a gift to Paul. You know, it's a timing issue. Something's not right, and so it's a timing thing. So the timing is wrong.
Question for you, Dr.
Yes.
So say that when we get into 1 Corinthians, we're seeing the opposite of what Paul is teaching in this last section of Philippians?
And what do you mean? Why is it the opposite?
I'm saying is that in the church of Corinth, they have problems with, particularly with the Lord's Supper, the rich eating up all the food.
Yep.
And you got all this, and yet almost like somebody owes each other something, as opposed to where here you're saying the gift, they're trying to operate in unity.
Correct. So Paul has different tones with different congregations. And the congregation in Philippi, Paul likes. They seem to have their act together. And so he's encouraging them to stay on track. When he's dealing with the church in Corinth, there's problems in Corinth. Lots of problems. Corinth is kind of a problem congregation for Paul. And so he's got other issues going on there. So yeah, and you can see there's a lot of situations where the church in Corinth was kind of a hotshot city and rather cosmopolitan. And are people going to be really steeped in this kind of Greek-Roman way of operating? Oh yeah, very much. And so is that part of what's going on in Corinth, where you've got the rich kind of putting down the poor and kind of the social stratification is showing itself in the church? Yeah, that's exactly what's going wrong in Corinth. And it's a big part of this. And so the contrast is pretty strong here. So what Paul is aware of is the Philippians are good, but he wants to make sure they stay there, because he knows the temptation to fall into this kind of a tit-for-tat stratification, is really there. And it's very prominent. He sees it going on in Corinth. He doesn't want that to happen in Philippi. So you're exactly right. Yep. And in fact, we're going to bring up Corinthians here again in just a minute, because it kind of plays out in some interesting ways. All right. So let's see where we got this. Yeah, good. All right, so let's deal with some of the details in here. So I rejoice that you've revived your concern for me. That's great. So now you've done this. And then we have this little parenthetical thing. And like I told you, Paul's doing these things, he's just dictating the letter. So he's thinking, okay, he's got his little outline written out. Gift from Philippians. All right, this is next on his list. He's going to get, now, okay, thanks for the gift. Oh, wait, not thank you. I rejoice that you gave the gift. Very cool. All right, so he's recognizing that. And he says, not that I had any need. This is again, he's trying to balance this out. Did I need you to give me that gift? Nope, I was just fine. I can get by with anything. I can live without food. I don't need anything. And so Paul, basically, he's trying to get into kind of, in a sense, qualify this gift a little bit. You gave me this gift, but it's not like, oh, I would have died if you hadn't given it. No, that's not the point. I'm fine. So he's qualifying the gift, and it's not meant to disparage it. It's just meant to get it in the right kind of place. I know it does. And see, this is why I'm making this point, because you guys have all been trained. You should be thankful. Write your thank you letter. Write a note. Say thanks. And we have been trained in gratitude like crazy. And Paul is grateful, but he's careful. And so he's grateful to God for what they've done. And the point is, there are bigger things they need to learn. And that's the point. And so that's what's going on here. And that's why I'm stressing this, because you're right. It does start to sound like, where's the gratitude? Why isn't he grateful? And that's precisely the point. Because if he comes across with a grateful attitude, it can feed all of this negative stratification. You don't want that to happen. So that's the thing that's going kind of funny here. And so Paul's simply saying, you guys are being good Christians. Well done. Keep it up. That's what he's doing. And the gift, yeah, it's just part of what you do. That's exactly the point. Exactly the point. And you want to put a label of ungrateful on Paul? Go for it. I'll be reluctant to do that. I think Paul has a bigger issue here, and he's teaching them something really important. All right, so verse 11. Not that I speak from need, okay, or according to need, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. And this is critical. He's learned to be content. Doesn't matter what's going on around him. Doesn't matter how much the world is falling apart. Doesn't matter how much he has, how little he has. Doesn't matter how much better the neighbors are doing. Doesn't matter. He's content in whatever circumstances. And now he spells it out. I can know how to get along with little. I also know how to live in prosperity. He's had it both ways. In fact, when he was in Philippi, where was he living? Do you remember? He was living at Lydia's house on her estate. So was Paul enjoying a comfortable life? Probably. Lydia seemed to have some means. And so he's staying with Lydia. He's got his own bed. He's got meals being prepared for him. This is pretty cool. He's enjoying it. So Paul knows how to have prosperity. He knows what it's like to live in prison. He knows what it's like to live under house arrest. He knows what it's like to be shipwrecked. He knows all of these things. So he knows a lot of stuff. So he knows how to live in prosperity, and he knows how to live with little. He can handle it. So that's what he's getting at. In any and every circumstances, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, having abundance and suffering need. And what's the secret? I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So the point Paul is making, and this is where this cross-stitch verse comes in, whatever is happening to me, I just run it all through the lens of Jesus, and it's fine. And that's what's going on here. So what Paul's doing is he's putting into practice what he just told the Philippians to do. Pray about it and follow an example. Whose example is Paul following? Jesus. Exactly. Exactly. Which is why he can tell them to follow his example. And so what you've seen in me do, and what did Paul? Paul had learned about the life of Christ. He had not walked with Jesus, but he knew it. He had spent time with the apostles. He had studied. He had been in conversation with them. He had learned. And so he has the example of Jesus. He's following that. He has his prayers. He talks to God. He can be content in any circumstance. So what's the secret? It's trusting God. This is critically important. And I want you to see how different what Paul is doing from how people operate today with this. How does Paul's contentment differ from stoic, stiff upper lip ideas? Now, what do I mean by that? What do I mean by a stoic, stiff upper lip? Yes. I can handle what happens. And so when stuff happens and it's bad, you just soldier through. You be very British about it. You know, keep calm and carry on. The World War II phrase they dug out of a vault somewhere now. It's been published all over the place. I love it. It was actually prepared in UK during the war back in the 30s and the 40s, and they had this all around. Keep calm and carry on. That's right. That's the British way of dealing with things. You just tough it out. That's the stoic, stiff upper lip. You just soldier through. You get it done. And we have all heard this, and we have all been encouraged to do this. We've been taught this. Suck it up, deal with it, get through it, come on. You've all heard this. And we see this as a resilient, really cool thing in our kids. We try to teach this, tough it out, get it through. Is that what Paul is doing here? And the point is, it's not. It's not. Paul is not doing a stoic, stiff upper lip, soldier through. He's not doing that. What he's doing is something quite different. Because for Paul, because see, when I'm doing the stiff upper lip and soldier through, who's making it happen? I am. I am. I've got to choose not to panic. I've got to choose to tough it out. I've got to choose to sacrifice. I've got to choose to be cold or hungry. I'm going to get through this. I'm going to do this. And when you're doing it, you're doing it. And that's how the Stoics operated. The Stoics were all about self-control. Think about how Buddhists operate. The core of Buddhism is self-control, self-possession. You getting control of yourself. You getting control of your emotions. You are become the master. And so the center of everything is self. That's what's going on here. Paul is not doing that. Because for Paul, what is the source of all of his strength? It's right. He's looking at Christ. He's looking at God. God is the source. And so it's not him who's doing it. It's Christ in me. So the secret Paul has learned is not, I just tough it out. I learned to ignore the pain. None of that. He's not talking like a Marine here. He's talking about, I've learned to let Christ live in me. I pray, I ask God for the strength, and God sustains me. It's a very different way of operating. And the other thing that's kind of key here is also the circumstances. Paul recognizes reality. See, a lot of times people who are trying to deal with tough circumstances, and in a sense, deny the reality. I'm not going to face that. They skirt around it. They kind of dodge the circumstances. Paul meets the circumstances straight on. They are what they are. I'm imprisoned. I'm shipwrecked. This is what's happening. He's not afraid to call a thing what it is. He deals with it straight up. So that's what's going on here. So Paul is not independent. This is kind of the point. He's not self-sufficient. He is absolutely dependent on God and on others. And that's the key thing here. So he is dependent upon God and he's dependent on others. So does he depend on the Philippians? Yeah, he does. Even though he's not going to say thanks and express gratitude, he recognizes there is a reciprocity. That's how his life works. And so when he doesn't know the answer to a problem, he doesn't despair because God's in charge and he's in a context and a network and a community of all these other people, and we'll all get through this. That's what Paul's doing. And so Paul's not independent. He's not self-sufficient. And there's such a contrast here between the American way that we try to encourage our kids to be. Self-sufficient, don't let anybody bring you down, you take care of you, you make it happen, and we teach people to be very autonomous. That's not the way of the Christian faith. The Christian faith is interconnected. When somebody's weak, others prop him up. When others can't go on, others help them get through that. And so we help each other. That's the Christian way of operating. We're always interconnected, always interdependent, and this interdependence is not a negative thing, not something to be ashamed of, not something to regret, but something to actually recognize and even embrace. That's what Paul's doing here. So Paul is never self-sufficient. He's absolutely dependent upon everybody else. All right? Yes?
So it's safe to say Paul here is taking a subtle yet critical dig at the way the world operates.
Absolutely.
Like we were talking earlier where I'm thinking in this, yeah, we both have stiff-upper lips, but I know that for me being in Christ, I know I can't, there's some stuff I can't do anything about, so I have to put my trust in God.
That's
But
right.
The world is not going to see that.
That's right. And see, you're right. This is a very different way of operating than the world does. And it was different in Paul's day. Because in Paul's day, the ideal was this kind of Roman self-sufficiency, stoic kind of thing. And that was built in. And Paul's pushing hard against that. And we need to recognize this too, because we live in this Western, autonomous, insulated kind of a sphere. That's how we operate. And we all want to be independent and self-sufficient. So we stockpile food in our bomb shelter so whatever happens, we're safe. And if a zombie apocalypse happens, I'm fine. I'm not going to depend on anybody. And we even have people who, will move out to Wyoming and get off the grid. I don't need anybody. This is something that people, I don't want to depend. It's not Christian. It's not something we should cultivate. It's not something we should encourage. Interdependence, we all need each other. That's the Christian way of operating. It's exactly Paul's point. It is a form of idolatry because you're trusting self, not God. That's right. Quite right.
I'm struggling with this. This is the first time I realized that there was a contribution of Paul. Is there other places in the letters where they talk about?
No. See, actually, Paul is very careful about not usually taking gifts. And we're going to get to that in just a minute on page 2, on the backside of worksheet 10.
That's one of the things that I always wondered about, this day of all the preachers that are, getting money. And
oh, yeah.
I'm thinking, so, that Paul did this without, much fanfare. And then this whole thing here with all these things he's saying about that I can do without, in the light of a gift, I mean, it seems to me like he's making it sound like, well, I don't need this money.
Thanks, but no thanks. Yeah, exactly right. And that's why the ingratitude.
Yeah. We're talking about all this self-sufficient and all this other stuff.
Uh-huh.
And it's all because of this gift, I guess. If I put it in context, I'm going, well, it sounds like he's just kind of saying, I didn't need this money, but thanks.
In a sense, that's exactly what he was saying. And if that sounds crassly ungracious, fine, hear it that way. But see, that's the whole point. Because see, what Paul is envisioning is we are in this thing called the church together. Jesus is Lord. We follow him. And we help each other in that following. And we have responsibilities to each other. He who has a lot needs to help him who has little. And the one who has little helps the one, help in all the ways. We all work together in this. That's exactly his point.
But he doesn't sound like he's saying, part of this is helping each other. You just helped me, but I'm not going to thank you. I mean,
That's right, because it's such a precarious thing. And we see, this is what's maybe hard for us to understand, because we don't maybe get the depth of this kind of social stratification, this kind of status power game going on, and how disruptive this can be. And I'm getting ahead of myself just a little bit. This comes up here shortly. When we get to the next section, we'll be getting into this, is where Paul actually points out that he doesn't usually operate this way. In fact, when he goes to most churches, he makes a point, I take nothing from you. That's how he operates, because he's so concerned about this. Even though, should we be operating with this kind of interconnectedness? Absolutely. But because it's very dangerous, I'm going to try to teach you something else first. That's what he's doing here. That's right. All right, now before we get to that, one last thing in this section I want to point out here. He talks about, I've learned to live with little and in prosperity in every circumstance. I know the secret, and that secret, as we've already said, is that twofold thing of recognizing God and the interdependence. And that's the secret to learning to be content, is God's in control, and God's going to work through the people around me. It's going to be fine. Now, but he makes the point, though, that it's important to remember that abundance does not alleviate anxiety, does it? And I'm talking to people who live in the West, and you're Americans, and so you have an abundant life, whether you think you do or not. Just look at yourself compared to the rest of the world, and you'll be shamed into realizing, wow, when I think I don't have much, that's ridiculous. And so we have in a life of abundance. Does that mean anxiety goes away when you have a lot? No. In fact, you can even make the argument that the more stuff you get, the more you will worry, right? Because now you're worried about keeping it and making it work, and you've got more to deal with. That's why the more junk you have, the more things you worry about. If you own a house, now you got to take care of a house. If you rent a house, what's your attitude? Not my problem. And so when the furnace goes out and you're in the rental house, whatever, not my problem. But when you own it, now it's your problem. And if you need a new roof, well, who's going to cover that? So then you get a summer house. Oh, so now you've got even more. But now you've got two houses with two furnaces and two, well, maybe it's not a summer house only or whatever. But anyway, you get the idea here. And the more stuff you get, the more junk you have to worry about. And so when people think that, well, if I just had whatever, then all my problems will go away. It's a flat-out lie. The more stuff you have, the more you worry, and the more you have things to keep track of. So anxiety is always an issue. Whether you have a little or a lot, anxiety is an issue. That's why Paul says, I've learned in prosperity or in want. And we need to learn it in both things. Both things. All right. Now, how might sharing in Paul's affliction have entailed a risk for the Philippians? Because Paul talks about, you have now shared with me in my difficulty. And we need to recognize there's actually the chance that, if Paul's a prison of Rome, in Rome, and now here comes Epaphroditus from Philippi and says, I've got a gift for Paul. Well, what's that do to Epaphroditus and the contingency from Philippi? They're guilty by association. And that's the same idea here. So there's this kind of a risk even for the Philippians of a guilt by association. Because Paul is a persona non grata in Rome, and so now they're supporting Paul. Well, that doesn't look very good for them. So that's why he talks about you're sharing in my suffering and my difficulty. That gift does come with a risk to them, and he's acknowledging that. He's recognizing we have this kind of common ground here in this common gift and in our common distance from the rest of society. All right, now that sets us up for our last part, which is our last 8 verses, which we'll bang into next week, and we'll see how far we get. Any final questions this week on Paul and his gift and his lousy, ungracious attitude? All right.
I know we don't know, but what do you think the reaction of the Philippians would be to this letter?
Yeah. How would the Philippians have received Paul's letter? Would they say, what? He didn't even say thanks. No, I don't think so. I think they would say, right, this is consistent with everything he taught us. This is how things work in the church. This is what we do. And so they would see the consistency, and they're not like thinking, oh, Paul's being really ungrateful, and nah, that's the last time we sent him a gift. Because, in fact, he's going to indicate they've done this before. And so there's a pattern of this gift giving, and so it's consistent with how things operate. It's exactly how they're learning to see things. And that's the biggest point of all this. You see, in the Christian faith, you're entering a new community, a new way of operating, a new way of seeing things, a new reality. And the Philippians are learning this, and they're learning how different it is from the rest of the world. And that's what Paul's teaching them. That's exactly what's going on here. All right, let's close with a word of prayer. We thank you, Lord God, for bringing us to this beginning of a new year. And we ask you to direct and guide us through these coming days, that we walk in your truth and learn to see the world and the things around us the way you would have us to see them. To learn to see what is true and noble and good and focus on those things. And when the realities of the world come, that we see those in your eyes and learn to see them with confidence and with certainty that you will care for us. Guide us and direct us in this coming week, that we are a good example of those around us, and we seek out your truth and live in that truth in all that we do. We pray it in Christ. Amen. Blessings on your week, gang. We'll see you back next week.